of the other things I'll try to do, so it's week one, we're kind of doing an intro to ASP.NET. If you guys ask a question in class, I'll usually try to repeat the question so that the question gets captured on the video stream. Unless you're sitting near the front, it's not gonna capture your voice. I'll often, if you guys answer questions again, I'll often repeat your answer so that we've got the benefit of getting that information into the video. All right, so if we look at our first question, maybe for the people in the front two rows, why are we bothering? Why are we gonna spend 4 months learning ASP.NET? Why don't we do something else? What'd you find out?
It's very structured.
Okay. Absolutely, yep.
Your applications.
Yep.
Popular breed.
Yep. What else could we say about it?
Generate web apps, which are more and more being used.
Yep. Adam?
Well structured. And
Yep.
well supported.
Yeah, so well structured, well supported is another big one. Absolutely. Okay, there's a reason we use .NET in enterprise computing, right? You're probably not going to use .NET. You could, but where do we typically see it? What kinds of places are likely to use ASP.NET for web applications? Okay, so what kind of industry would we expect to find, or what kind of organization would you expect to find a lot of ASP.NET development? Okay, yeah, so tech companies, yep. Who else? Who's got large scale IT infrastructure? What kinds of industries? Yeah, so finance is a big one. Finance and insurance. They're building large, scalable, enterprise level. Any other ones you can think of that would have that kind of scale? Yep. That's a huge one, particularly in Canada. So a good friend of mine is a IT project manager for the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. All of their development is done in .NET, all of it. It's all C# on the front end, and actually, for some strange reason, they use Oracle databases rather than SQL Server, which I don't understand. But virtually, if you get a job as a developer for the federal government, chances are you're working with .NET. Okay? So it's designed for the enterprise, really. I guess the other thing I would add, it's extremely robust, meaning it has a huge feature set. And the development environment, we use Visual Studio, as one of my colleagues, Tom, maybe Tom's taught some of you, Tom likes to refer to Visual Studio as the king of all IDEs. Nothing else has the feature set and the power that Visual Studio has. Okay, and we'll see that. So it's a beast. It takes up a lot of space. It takes a while. There's a learning curve in learning how to use it, but the things it can do for us are incredibly powerful and really help us as a developer in terms of productivity. And we'll even see some of those things today when we start using it. Okay, I think this question we already answered. So where would we go for resources? Yeah, so we just go to the official site, which is ASP.NET. Everything you could possibly need is there, including forums. That was one other thing I didn't point out. They also have user forums, so much like Stack Overflow. If you're getting an error, you have a bug, you can go ahead, and it's quite well broken down. I used to spend a lot of time hanging out. I've gotten lots of answers here over the years. I would also hang out here and answer questions from people. All right, so we need to spend a bit of time talking about MVC architecture. Who can help us get our head around what that is? All right, Jeff?
It's a design pattern for implementing user interfaces.
Okay. So MVC is not particular to any framework or technology. There are all kinds of use this pattern. So ASP.NET MVC is just one of them. Talk about some of the others. So the M, the V, and the C, what the heck do all these things mean? Today will be the last day of your lives that someone could ask you the question, what is MVC? And you won't know. So what is MVC? All right, so it's model, view, controller. And what does each of these things mean? What is a model? What is its purpose? What does it do?
So a model, it represents database data as an object in your code, and it allows you to manipulate the database while keeping that logic away from the other logic.
You got it. Okay, so our models basically are similar to the kinds of classes you would have built in your intro to OO. Probably, did you guys have Jarrett for that class? Some of you? Most of you?
I think so.
No? Or Andrew? So the models that we build in an MVC application will be similar to the kind of class objects you built in Java. Okay? So they represent some kind of business object with a series of properties and methods for that object. But MVC models are a little different. We'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. What about the views? What is it? Okay. Not only display, what else can it do besides display data? So it can display data. What else can our views do with data? Yeah. It can also be used to capture user data. So it's basically the views is our UI layer, our user interface. So in the case of what we're doing in this class, what are we going to be using to build our UI? Our UI is going to be made up of what kind of technologies? We won't use C# so much for the view layer. Ahmed? Yeah, our views are going to be basically HTML and CSS, right? Because that presentation layer is generated in a browser. So that's one option, and for the purpose of this class, that's what we're concerned with. What other options do we have, though, to build an MVC type application? What other types of views could we have besides web pages, besides HTML, CSS files? Yeah, we could have forms. Our application might run on a desktop. So it may be Windows forms. What else? What other kind of interface could we have on the front end of an MVC app?
Mobile.
Yeah, so mobile. We may have a mobile UI, which is not HTML. It's not a desktop interface. So the idea here is really, this is its own component. So if we've got the data, we've got the UI, what do the controllers do? The name is probably a pretty good description of what it does. What's the purpose of the controller?
Controls the communication between the UI and the models.
Yeah, so in effect, it's the logic. So it's like the traffic cop that goes in between the data on the back end and whatever views, whatever the UI we have, web, desktop, mobile, something else. It goes in between. One of the other nice things about this structure is maybe some other application wants access to some of our data. They've got their own view layer. They don't need a view from us. They just need logic and data from our layer, from our application. What do we call that kind of service? Yeah, so we want to build an API so some other application can either submit data to us or consume our data. Well, all we need is to build the model and the view, sorry, the model and the controller. We don't need a view. Bang, we have an API. So it's easy if we have our own application to then expose that data to other applications through an API. So that's hopefully what we're going to do down at, in the last couple weeks of class, we're going to work with Web API. So basically exposing our data in JSON format, in JavaScript arrays. So MVC is not new. it didn't get created with ASP.NET. It was created quite a bit before that. What are some of the reasons to use that so many different technologies use this architecture pattern? What does it allow us to do?
It's scalable and it separates things from certain.
The one is it's easy to scale. We can grow our application easily. This is a big one. Separation of concerns. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, so when we see a structure, if I want to change my data page, so if I want to replace how my view looks, it's not entangled with any of the other code. It's all separated, so it's very easy to swap out a file.
You got it. So here's a PHP page I built in winter semester, an intro to web programming. Right? So here we've got some HTML presentation that appears on our form. This was our list of albums with a search box. This stuff, so some of it would be considered logic, right? We're making decisions with an if statement. We've got SQL queries here, so we're connecting to our database and running queries to fetch data. All of this stuff is all jammed together. So why does this pattern of separating out the data piece, the logic piece, and the presentation, how does this help us? There's a number of ways it helps us as we're building applications, as opposed to this style where everything's all in one. The logic, the presentation, the data, it's all in one file.
It's fewer lines of code.
Okay, so we have fewer lines of code, not overall, but per file.
Yeah.
We have more files, but each file is smaller. Okay, that's one benefit. What else does this help us do?
Maybe because it is smaller, it's easier for error.
Absolutely, right? Because we know if it's a logic error, we don't have to bother looking through all the code in the view or in the model. If it's a data error, we know we can go to the model. The problem's got to be there somehow. So debugging is way easier. What else would be easier?
Just like with both of those, it's a lot more readable,
Yep.
which I think is
Yep. What if we're working with a team of developers, which probably a lot of you were on co-op? Why would this structure be easier than building applications with this kind of structure?
Because you can task each individual section to different people.
Absolutely. Okay, so there's two ways we could do this. So the three of us are working on an application. You know, we're building the music store. We could say, Daniel, you're doing the albums. You deal with the album model, the album controller, and all the views related to albums. Will, you're going to do the artist. I'll do the shopping cart. So we could divide the labor that way. Or maybe you're the UX guy. So you're going to do all the views, and we don't want you anywhere near the logic or the data. We're not going to let you touch that. Right? So we could specialize that way. So we're not working all in the same in each other's files. It's really easy to divide work as a team much more easily with this structure. Can you think of any other benefits?
Easier to update.
Absolutely. This is one other big one. We build an application for somebody and they ask for a feature. By encapsulating all of the logic of that feature into these files, if some other application needs the same feature, we can bring the model, bring the controller very easily from one application, port it to another one, put a different set of views on it. So let's say we're building a web application, our customer wants newsletters, right? I want to be able to enter newsletters online, email them out, have a list of newsletters. So we build that for somebody. Well, chances are somebody else is going to want that same feature set. They're just going to want the pages to look different. By encapsulating the logic this way, it's really easy for us to reuse code. So over time, we can build up a library, our own library of reusable modules. Yep, saves money, saves time. So we're not reinventing or copying and pasting. Everything is its own file, own small encapsulated file. So So we're going to see this pattern over and over and over again. The great thing is, once we understand how to use MVC, and Adam and I were having this conversation because he's working with a PHP MVC framework called Laravel. Once you understand the pattern, then you can go and pick up MVC. So you want to go and work with another language, you'll understand the architecture because the structure is the same. Okay. So what are some of our other options besides ASP.NET if we want to use this architecture pattern? Yep.
I also know Spring is a good Java framework.
Anybody know any other MVC frameworks? Other languages? Yeah, so Node.js, which you guys will do your next semester back here. Probably the first really, the technology that really popularized MVC, sort of like the grandfather, is Ruby on Rails. This was the first widely used MVC architecture. So the great thing is, after this course, if you want to go and learn Ruby, it'll be easy. All you have to do is learn the syntax. So, but in terms of how the structure works and how the application flow works, it's exactly the same in Ruby as it is in ASP.NET. We should spend a couple minutes talking about this question. So as I sort of mentioned earlier, there are sort of three different streams of ASP.NET development. The stream we're going to use is called ASP.NET MVC. As I said, it came out in 2009, I believe, was the first release of .NET MVC. There's an older version of ASP.NET. That was your only choice from 2002 until 2009. That's kind of become a legacy technology called web forms. Many of the applications I've built, many of my older ones that are still around, are built using web forms. In fact, I've been updating one that a client wants some updates on. I tried to convince them to rebuild it with MVC. They didn't have the money to do it. So it's still in web forms for now. I used to teach web forms in this course, because we will see legacy code. Microsoft's really moved away from it, so I didn't see any value in teaching it to you guys. Okay, so that's the old version. There's MVC. What's the other one? Their newest version, also cross-platform. That's right, so .NET Core. So I want to have a quick look at Core. We may play around with Core when we do Web API the last few weeks of the semester. We might do some Core. Now, Core also follows MVC, so the structure of Core is fairly similar. If we just do a quick look here for a second. So they're going to give us choices. If we go to the Learn page, it's asking which one do you want? .NET, which basically means MVC, or Core. So here's, I won't read the descriptions to you. You're all literate. You can read the descriptions. So here's their little comparison. Now, Core does have a few things to recommend it. It's supposed to be faster. It will not only run on Mac or Linux. These are the first .NET apps in 15 years that ever would run on anything other than Windows. You don't even need Visual Studio. You can use Visual Studio Code, which is like a lightweight version. Some of you may have used it basically as a code editor in some of your other classes. So you can actually write core apps with Visual Studio Code. You don't need the full, big Visual Studio version. So if you kind of look at this comparison, you may think, well, if Core is newer, it's faster, it's cross-platform, why are we doing MVC? Why shouldn't we do Core? Which is a valid question. And I actually considered using Core for this whole class, but I decided we should do MVC instead. Anybody have any thoughts on why we're going to use MVC rather than using Core for the bulk of the course? There's really a few reasons. Joel?
Maybe more user-friendly, you're more used to teaching this.
Well, that's probably true, but not actually why I made it. I mean, I try to do what's best for you guys. If it's more work for me, I'm okay with that. That's why they pay me, right?
lot of the work out there is available with updating the ASP.NET MVC program.
Yeah, that's a big one. Core is so new that you won't find a lot of places that are using it yet. What's the other problem with doing a brand new technology? Less resources.
Learning curve.
Yeah, and also there are going to be a lot more bugs in the framework because it's new, right? MVC is more mature. It's been around for 8 years. So in a few years, well, in a few years when I do this class, maybe 2 years from now, it'll be core. And don't worry, you won't miss out. All the lessons will be on YouTube. You can go watch them if you're working a .NET shop and think, hey, that jerk's teaching core now. I wish he could have taught core to us. All the lessons will be on YouTube for you. So you can go catch up. Eventually, we may switch. The other big thing, and this kind of comes back to what you guys mentioned, what I actually did in making up the syllabus and deciding was I went here. So I clicked through a whole mess of postings for ASP.NET developers because I wanted to see what is the job demand like for core. I saw core in very few of these. I saw a few that asked for web forms because obviously they got a lot of legacy apps, a few asking for core, and virtually every one of them said .NET MVC. So that to me really kind of made the decision easy because really this is what we're all about, right? This is where we're trying to get you guys. So if the market is the job market for development in this space is asking for .NET MVC, I thought it made the most sense to spend most of our time with it. As I said, if we have a chance to play around with core a little bit, we will. I think would be nice to touch on, but I would think the focus should be where the jobs are for you. Speaking of which, one of the other reasons, again, we're teaching this in enterprise. So 800, this is in the last 30 days. If we just compare this, and the reason we teach PHP first and we teach ASP.NET second, few more jobs, maybe about 10% more jobs in PHP. But if you look at the salaries, right, relative to the number of jobs, .NET developers get paid more than OpenStack developers. There's a reason for this. Why do you, it's the same reason that we taught you PHP in semester 2 and we teach you .NET in semester 3 after you've had your co-op. It's not, it's not a random choice.
It's harder than harder.
Yeah, right? PHP, really all you need is Notepad and W3 schools, and you can probably bang out some functioning code. This is, like I said, that's the tricycle version of web development. This is the motorcycle version. So the market compensates people accordingly. I'll just save those notes. Anybody care to, oh, we have a piece of chalk. Anybody care to take a stab at maybe just giving us a visual of the MVC pattern of how this kind of works? For those of you who are visual learners, we've been talking about it for a while. It's probably sinking in for some of you, but not for others. All right, well, I got one for you, which I'll turn on. So let's just talk for a minute about how this works. I'll make this available. We'll let you view it, sure. Why not? So here's the way the pattern works. And again, it's irrespective of what language we're using or what type of user interface we have, the flow is the same. So we've got some kind of end client, maybe where they're on a computer, maybe they're on a mobile device, interacting with a native mobile app, doesn't matter. So that client's going to make some kind of request to the application. Right? So in our case, it probably will look something like this. One of the other great things about, a couple other great things about MVC. One is all of the URLs are extensionless, right? It doesn't say .aspx, .php, or anything else. Better for search engines, cleaner, more descriptive URLs. And also, generally, our URL requests, they have meaning. right? Probably everybody in this room can figure out what's going to happen with a request at that URL. What are we asking for? What are we telling the server to do if I enter that kind of URL?
Go into albums and find the file 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, go to the albums table in the database and give me the data for that particular album. Or, you know, maybe it's something like this. Maybe it's not even 1, 2, 3, maybe it's the album title, something like that. So it's set up to give descriptive requests by URI, which is great. So the dispatcher, so that's in effect, in our case, a web server, right? It interprets that URL, and the URL goes to a controller. Now, one thing I didn't mention about this that I probably should, that somebody mentioned in yesterday's class, but this is an important point about MVC. One of the huge benefits of MVC is what's called convention over configuration, which is probably a term some of you may have heard of before. What does that mean, convention over configuration, to us as developers? If we think about
Is it intuitive?
good guess, not exactly. Here's what happens. I'll explain what happens in this scenario of this URL, and then maybe it'll be clear, somebody can try and define it. Right? We all know that this is going to go to the albums table and look for an album called the White Album. Right? That's what it's going to do. How does it know to do that? Any MVC framework is going to look for a file called, well, in this case, because it's ASP.NET, the file name it's going to look for, and we will wind up building this, is albumscontroller.cs. Okay. This file will automatically look for a model called this. Because we're passing information in that model, so the controller passes a read request to the model, passes in the name of that album as a parameter. The model spits back an album object populated from the database table, and then the controller will hand that data off to our web page, which will render the data in HTML and CSS. Right? So there's the structure. What's important is this file. So we're going to have albums controller in a folder called controllers. We're going to have artists controller, customers controller, orders controller, and then we're going to have a models folder with album, artist, order, customer. So what does that tell you about convention over configuration?
Follow convention instead of configuring it to do specifically what you want.
You got it. Rather than us setting up configuration, the configuration is baked into the MVC architecture. And they have a whole bunch of rules, naming conventions, and site architecture, where certain files are and how they're named. But if we follow these rules, so this will be in, we're not going to make an albums folder and put all the albums files there. The MVC architecture doesn't like that. It wants a controllers folder, a models folder, and a views folder. But by following the conventions of where the files go and how they're named, it automatically does a whole lot of stuff for us. So in this process, one of the cool things is we don't have to connect to the database. The model does it automatically. We don't have to write a single SQL query. The model does it. We will not write any SQL in this class. We don't have to do it. It's baked in. Okay. We don't have to tell it which controller to use and which model to use. As long as we have these names, any URL request that starts with the word albums is automatically handled, all the logic's handled here. Now, we can override these things if we need to, but most of the time we won't want to because it just automates so much of the work for us. Follow the rules and we'll do a lot of the work for you is kind of the idea of the convention over configuration. So when we need to override things, we can. But by default, we don't. So somebody asked me this question in class yesterday. How would you override? Let's say we don't want this URL. For whatever reason, you know, the convention URL isn't good. And I'll give you an example. So I did this site not long ago, built a little content manager using .NET MVC. It was good practice for teaching the class. Okay. So in here, in this database, there's a table called pages that holds all the content of each page, right? So the way the architecture was set up, I would have to do this. Well, that's a crappy URL. I don't want the word pages part of all of my URLs, right? So I had to override the convention. So I have the ability to do it if I want. So what I did, and here's the project in Visual Studio. I think it's there's a startup file. That's not the right one. Where I could override the URL pattern. Here's a root file. So what I've done is overridden, if it's the pages controller. Oh, here, yeah. I've overridden these roots. So I've overridden their handling because it doesn't work the way I want it to quite out of the box. So the general practice is follow the rules and then write in your own, override them with your own exceptions when you need to. But most of the time, following the rules will save us a lot of work. All right. So all your MVC applications work this way. It doesn't matter whether we're in the .NET world or we're doing Ruby or Laravel, Node, something else. They all have kind of similar pattern to it, which is great. So once we set up this structure, good to go. So I'll leave these notes here. There'll probably be some questions on this stuff on the midterm, but you can always come back to lesson 1, read the notes, answer the questions. I'm fine with that. Okay, so let's try playing around a little bit and see how this kind of works in practice. So if you want to open up Visual Studio, again, whatever version you have, doesn't matter. Mine will be slow to open because my 2015 is the enterprise. It's the full, I sort of went the whole 9 yards and got all the features. So a bunch of cool stuff you'll notice right away. You've got built-in Git integration, so you can easily just commit to GitHub right from Visual Studio. You don't need command prompt. You don't need the desktop client. You can do it right from here, which is great. They also publish news probably every couple of days. So anything new that's happening in the .NET world, it's right here on the splash screen in the Open Visual Studio. You can turn that off, but I actually find that really useful to know when new stuff's come out, updates, patches, changes, things like that. And they even got a bunch of videos, which is cool. So to create a new project, so it'll show you your recent projects here. File, new project. Now remember, I said this is the king of all IDEs. Look at what we have the options to build from in here. You want to build Android or iOS? Cool. It's not like Android Studio. You wouldn't write it in Java, but Microsoft bought a company called Xamarin. Xamarin used to be a standalone company. It was a plugin for Visual Studio. Has anybody heard of Xamarin or know what it is? Yeah, Joel, what is it? Okay. Xamarin allows you to write native Android or iOS apps in C#. You don't have to use Swift for iOS. You don't have to use Java for Android. So you can actually, it used to be a plugin to Visual Studio, but a year and a half ago, Microsoft bought them. So it's now baked in. You install Visual Studio, you get Xamarin. So you want to use C# and build an iOS app? Go ahead. You can do it. Cloud apps, Office SharePoint, tons and tons of stuff here. So what we're interested in, the Windows desktop apps, what we're interested in under web, the only real option here is ASP.NET Web Application. So just pick that. If you have a different version of the framework, if you're in 2017, you're probably on version 4.6 or 4.6.1 or 2 of the .NET framework, that's fine. Doesn't matter. Those differences are pretty minor. This box may be checked by default. We can uncheck it. This application insights, that allows you to do data mining on your usage. It adds some bloat to the project. Won't hurt anything if you leave it on, but we really don't need it for our purposes. So you can uncheck this one if it's here. Your default location is Documents, Visual Studio with 2015, 2017, and then Projects. You can save your stuff there. I've created a COMP2007 folder on my computer. So I've created a Wednesday folder, I'll create a Thursday folder, and I'll stick all my projects in here. You don't need to do. So if you want to save to the default location, that's fine, no problem. You want to set up another location on your machine, go ahead. So I'm going to call this, it gives it a default name of Web Application 1. I'll name mine with each lesson, so I'll have lesson 1, 2, 3, etc. For lesson 1, and check off create a directory for the solution. Otherwise, put all your stuff from every week in just one folder. So it's probably best to have a subfolder for each week. If you want, you can initialize Git right here, right now. I don't think I'll bother today. We're not going to do enough code that it's really worth it for me to put on Git, but I will after this week. You also can, I've got my Azure credentials already here, so I can already publish to Azure. We don't need to use an FTP client to get our stuff online. We have 2 ways of doing it. We can, if we're connected to an Azure account, we can publish directly. The other thing we can do is we can deploy first to GitHub and then have Azure connected to our Git repositories. That's the best way. That way, every time we make a new commit to GitHub, Azure automatically checks every 60 seconds for a new version on GitHub. So you just deploy your new code, make a new commit to GitHub, and in 60 seconds, your changes are live on Azure. So we'll do that maybe next week. So I'm just going to create my lesson 1 solution. And then it's got more questions. Hold on, before we do it, do you want an empty project with nothing in it? Legacy web forms? Are we building an API where there is no user interface, just model and controller? Single page app. What we want is MVC. We can add unit tests if you want. We'll deal with that later. We'll leave that out for now. We'll do, maybe spend a lesson later on in the course on unit testing with .NET. And we've got these options too. Individual user accounts. We can say no auth at all. We could use our Outlook accounts, our work and school, or ask for Windows auth. We'll just leave it as individual user accounts so people can sign up. And notice what it says. For apps that store profiles in a SQL Server database, it also has built-in hooks for Facebook, Twitter, Google, Microsoft, or other logins. So all those, we talked about the .NET framework was mature, right? It came with a lot of pre-built stuff. So we want to let people log in with Facebook. We don't have to write a library to do it. We just plug it in and enable it, generate an API key on Facebook, plug that into the code, we're up and running. We'll maybe have a chance to do that in our authentication lesson. And again, if I want, I won't put this one on Azure, but if I want to, I can just check that one off and connect it up to Azure right away. So I'll click OK. Now, what this is going to build is a whole lot of stuff. I think we checked yesterday. By the time this is done spinning, there'll be 66 megs worth of files in our folder, which is a lot, but that's a lot. We maybe don't need everything. But the idea is behind this template, Microsoft said, well, 90% of applications, developers have to set them up and do all this stuff. What kinds of things would we have to set up every time we build a new web application? What kinds of things are probably going to need to go in there, regardless of what type of application it is or who the client is? What do you have to do every time you make a new project?
CSS folder.
Yep, so things like CSS folder, and what might you want in that CSS folder to start with? Bootstrap, yep. What other kinds of things can we assume we might want? from the beginning, besides Bootstrap. Anywhere in the project.
An IMG file.
Yep, so a folder for images or static content, what other kinds of things? Yeah, JavaScript, and inside a JavaScript folder, what kinds of JavaScripts are we probably gonna want? There's at least one library in particular that every website uses. Works with Bootstrap. Starts with a J. jQuery, right? We're probably gonna want jQuery. If we have to follow these conventions, because we're building MVC, we're gonna need all these folders. So look what it gives us. We'll kind of do a little tour here. So we've got content, boom, there's our CSS. So it gives us Bootstrap, both the full version and the minified latest version, and it gives us a default style sheet that we can customize. So we want our own CSS. We've got a file we can work with. It gives us controllers, models, and views. We'll have a look in a second at what's in there. Not sure what's going on here. Come on. We've got scripts. So you mentioned JavaScript. That's where our front-end JavaScript. If you expand your scripts folder while mine hangs, how many scripts are in, how many JS files are in your scripts folder? How many JavaScripts did it give you to start? A lot. Maybe a dozen or so. I'm sure jQuery's in there, probably Modernizer's in there. Bunch of other common JavaScript tools. So again, you can get rid of any of the ones you don't want, but they're here. So we don't have to go out, find them, download them. It gives us a favicon. I think I'm gonna have to close mine. Visual Studio looks like it's dying. A slow, painful death. So a couple of the other things you'll notice if you expand yours. There's a file down at the bottom called web.config. Open that one up. And tell me what you think web.config is for.
Determining the media that your website's being viewed on.
Good guess. No. It's got a different purpose. But that's a very reasonable assumption. I'll try and open my project back up. There's one very important piece of information you can probably see inside your web.config near the top. I'll show you that window after. So what relevant piece of information do we see near the top here that will always go in web.config? It's basically an XML file of site configuration values. What's the most important site configuration value we need? You can see it here. Could be the language, yep. What's that? Right, our database connection. So they live here, and then they're global in the application. And so if we need to change or set, so it sets up a default local location, a local database file. So it will actually create and write to that database file without us doing anything else. But if we want to set up authentication, we can do it through here. Password protects certain files or folders or directories. We can set those rules up, manage global error handling. So what do we do when we get a 404 page? All that stuff's managed through here, through our web.config. So in one of these other apps, I can show you the real web.config. Right, so with mail server, other things related to database connection, those kinds of things are set up here. So if we have a look inside of controllers, it's actually given us 3 controllers already: home, account, and manage. It's given us 3 models. And it's given us views. So each section is in its own subfolder. There's also one called shared. So if we have a look at this file, so this is kind of neat. I'm not super impressed. Maybe I'll close my other Visual Studio instances, because this one doesn't seem to be very cooperative. If you open up this folder, views, shared _ layout.cshtml, open that up on your copy while mine hangs, what does it look like that file's purpose is? Yeah, so it's a template. They've pre-built a template with the header and footer, CSS and JavaScript links. Now, we don't have to keep that template. You can either blow it away and make your own, or you can start changing it. But at least it gives us a bit of structure to our design and layout as a starting point. Oh, there, finally opened. Okay. So it gives us a header. Now, if we actually want to launch this, I mentioned ASP.NET has its own built-in web server. To launch this in our browser, if you click on the debug menu, first of all, actually here, choose your default browser, probably set to Internet Explorer or Edge, which you can change. Don't press that button, just choose the browser you want. If you click on debug, and start without debugging. We'll look at the debugger in a minute. It's one of the other cool tools we have. So notice down here, before it launches, it's saying build started. What do you suppose is going on here? This is one of the other awesome features of ASP.NET. What does it mean to build an application? Alex, I'll ask you. You work with mainframes, right? Yeah. Well, Daniel, you said it. It's compiling. Okay. Why is our application compiling? We never had to compile PHP applications, right? We just press save. And then we went to the browser and we could see our changes. But with .NET, it's actually compiling them. It created, inside of lesson 1, in the bin folder, created a DLL file called lesson 1, so the name of my solution .dll. So I'll go into the bin. So ASP.NET gives us server-side code as opposed to PHP, which gives us interpreted server-side code. What's the difference between compiled code and server-side code? Sorry, interpreted code and compiled code. What's the difference? Compiled faster, absolutely. Why is it faster? You got it. So when we read when a PHP server, an Apache server, it has to process every time this page loads. Got to read all the code and interpret all of it, what it means. When we build a solution with Visual Studio, every time we change, we change HTML, but anytime we change any of the backend, the C# code, this stuff, we recompile, we rebuild that DLL, translate it into ones and zeros. So when it runs, it's way faster because it's compiled, it's running as binary, and also the compiled code can be cached. So it may be slow the first time, but then it's going to be much faster after that. So for performance, compiled code will always beat interpreted code. Now that's one great benefit of using .NET, and this was the first this was the first compiled code we could ever do for web applications. Until 2002, that we had no way of doing this. It's also awesome for us as developers for two other reasons. Performance is one huge benefit. Why else would this be useful to us? To be able to compile our code. Yes, that's another one. So let's go here. Here, let's try this. Let's go to controllers. Let's go to the home controller. So we've got three built-in methods: index, about, and contact. So I take out my semicolon there. To compile, I just click on build. Visual Studio tells me there's an error, but it also won't build the project. I can't compile it. So syntax errors, we no longer are catching syntax errors when our pages fail in the browser. We catch them at design time with Visual Studio. This saves us a ton of debugging time as a developer because the tool catches all our syntax errors. So if I just click here, so now I can mouse over, tells me my error, I can recompile. Catch errors faster because our code's compiled. It runs faster. Why else as developers? What are there are two other big benefits to having compiled code? I'll give you a hint. When we deploy this to the web server, I don't have to put any of these CS files online. All I have to put are the HTML and CSS files and this DLL, because all of the C# code lives in the DLL. So what's the benefit? What are the benefits of not publishing our individual source code files to the web server? There's two good things about this for us.
Less load.
Sorry?
Less load.
Yes, true. Security, right? The only server-side code that goes on the server is locked in a DLL file. You can't open a DLL. I mean, is it possible to hack them and reverse engineer them? It's not impossible. Nothing's impossible, but it's not as easy as, you know, if someone gets access to the web server with your PHP code, they have everything. Someone gets access to your .NET server, they don't have everything because they can't make changes, right? Unless they can reverse engineer that DLL and break them out into all the individual CS files. So why is this also good for us as developers? Besides the fact it's more secure. You build an application for a client, you put it on their server. What happens when they want changes to that application? They have to go to you because you have the source code and they don't. Right? If they want the source code, what typically happens, if you go to buy software, right, you can buy the end user version or you can buy the source code version. What's the pricing like when you want the source code version of something? Yeah, it's usually triple or quadruple the price of the end user version. So you say to your client, you want the source code? Sure. You can have the end user version or the source code version. Once I price those out, that usually they stop asking for the source code version at that point. The only bad thing is it means you can't make changes unless you have a machine with Visual Studio. So you're away for the weekend and you get an emergency call from your client that something's broken and you need to fix it. If it's PHP, you can jump on any computer, download the files through FTP, send them back up, you're good. If you don't have Visual Studio and access to your source code, which you've probably backed up on GitHub in a private repo, so you should have it anywhere. So we maintain ownership of our code, which is great for us as developers. So let's see how this works. So here's what we get. Here's our local host. So this is what we get out of the box without writing one line of code. We get our template. It's mobile responsive. We get our little hamburger pop-down menu. We have Bootstrap and jQuery. They gave us a few sample pages. It's slow because I recompiled. When you first recompile, the first page you load will be slow. After that, it'll be faster. They even gave us register and login that work. So here's about contact. So we can actually sign up for this and log in, and it will work. It'll create those credentials and store them. So again, if you don't want this, great. But most sites we're going to build are going to need this. So they've already done all this. We don't have to waste our time building it, which is awesome. So let's quickly see how this works, right? So when I click about, notice the URL, home, about. So here's what it does. If we look in the home controller, there's a method called about, right? The URL pattern matches the method name in the controller. The controller sets up a string variable, and then it says return view. Why does it not name the view it's going to load? Right? Here's the view in view home. Here's about. Use this area to provide additional information. So that's the view that's showing up. How does it know to load this particular view? Because the code here, it doesn't say load the view called views home about. It just does it. How do you suppose that happens? Yeah, because of the convention. The method's called about, so it automatically looks for a view with that name. I'll break it. So if I rename my view, so I'll rename it. Now I didn't change any C# code, so I don't have to recompile. I just renamed a file. So now when I click on about, I get the yellow error screen of death, right? Because that URL says about, it looks for a method called about, which looks for a view called about. And as long as I follow that pattern, I don't have to specify. Now, someone asked in yesterday's class, but what if I want the URL and the name of my actual view file to be different? Can I avoid this? The answer is yes. How do you suppose we could? So I'm going to leave the name here. Maybe I have some reason why my view has to be called about one. I could either change the method, but then that'll change the URL. The URL will be home about one. I could pass in specifically the name of a different view that the naming convention doesn't match. So I'll save that. We'll try it again. Same error, right? Home works, contact works. Why didn't it load about one? So we've said the about method should load the view called about one, but it didn't work. It still got view not found. I missed a step. What did I miss? Yeah, I have to rebuild because I made a change in the C# in the server-side code. So I need to regenerate my DLL by building. And once the build is complete, that error will go away now. So it says I built successfully. And now my URL about should be able to load. See, it looked for all of those files, couldn't find any of them. But now it should work. Like I said, it is slow. Somebody asked me, hey, can I set it so that it automatically builds every time I save a change? You can, but you don't want to because build is kind of slow. So don't build until you need to see your changes in the browser and test them. So now my about URL can load the view called about one because I've specified it here and compiled. Last cool thing I want to show you with Visual Studio. So the compilation was one of the best reasons to move to ASP.NET. If you weren't a developer, though, it made no sense to you. This is why it's not for the uninitiated or somebody with no programming experience, because all the benefits this offers only make sense to somebody who has some understanding of how programming works. Here's the other awesome thing that this has, which is runtime debugging, which saves us tons of time. So in here, I'll create a string variable. It tells me, hey, you're not using this variable anywhere, which I'm aware of. I'm going to click over here beside this line. And rather than running my application with the debugger inactive, if I just click debug and start debugging, here's what happens. This is the last thing I'm going to show you today, and then we're done for today. So it's going to rebuild, which will take a minute. It's going to launch the application again, but now it's the debug mode is active. So it'll kick it off again. So normally when I'm working, I don't have the debugger active. I only turn the debugger on when I'm trying to fix something or figure something out and I want to see the execution of the code. Okay, I'll show you another example in a minute. So it'll take a minute to load. So I've put in a breakpoint here. So right now, we've got a value of X. Come on, it's almost done. Okay, so I can go to home, I can go to contact, but when I go to about, before we see the view, look what happens. Visual Studio transfers execution into my code window. I can walk through my code at runtime, one line at a time, and I can evaluate what the heck's going on. So right now, to start, when the about method is triggered, my value of X is null. To go to the next line in the code, I press F11, and when I mouse over it, now shows me the value of X. So if we, in PHP, if we've got variables we don't understand, what do we have to do? Echo them out to the screen and try and figure out what was going on. With the runtime debugging, we can watch the program, see all the values, see our logic, our calculation, our workflow. If we have methods calling other methods, we can see the path our code is taking. Hey, or maybe we have a method and that method isn't getting fired. Well, we put a breakpoint in and we can see why it's not getting fired. So this saves hours and hours of time for developers trying to solve problems. It makes us so much more productive to have runtime debugging. And again, this was the first environment for web. This was the first tool web developers ever had in order to do this. And most of them still don't have it. Visual Studio's had this feature since 2002. And I can't count how much time and money this has saved. So we can see what's going on. I was using it today because I was working on a site where it's an English site. They've given me French content, and they said we want users to be able to click a French link and change to French, change back to English. So I got the link working. The content would change, but the link never changed. It said French all the time. And I couldn't figure out why the link never changed from Francais to English. So I put on the debugger, and I watched the execution, and I figured out where I went wrong. Okay, but without it, I would have spent way more time trying to solve that problem. So this is an awesome tool to have. So then the only thing is when the debugger is active, you can't make changes. So once you solve your problem, you need to stop the debugger so you can change your code, and then you need to start again without debug mode. Because basically I've taken the server offline now. Those pages won't load if I try and load them. So debug, stop, fix your problem, start without debugging again. Okay, I will set you guys free. So no lab, nothing to do. Your only homework for next week is make sure you have SQL Server installed. So next week, what I want to do is I'm going to give you a script that will populate the music store database in your SQL Server. So then we can make a new application and we can start building some of the controllers, playing around a bit more with how those work next week. All right? If you have trouble getting things set up, I have office hours next week. You can come to my office and I can help you get SQL Server installed if you need it.
So in theory, then,